fighter. He make great fights. I know in this fight when doctor don't stop, I win this fight. I win this fight by point, you know. You can see my fight record. I can knock in first round. I can fight this last round and knock him in 11 or 12 rounds. I want rematch. When doctor stop the fight, I won't fight again. I show for everybody I can be Lewis.
Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!
And they can't get it back! This should be the round of the century.
Look at Holyfield! What a warrior!
If he weighs 205, his heart weighs about 204.
It happened! It happened! I can't believe it. That was astonishing, and he hurts him with a hook. Corrales comes back a straight right. Now Castillo against the ropes. Unbelievable. Epic flow. Corrales waiting. Castillo's in trouble. Weak steps in, and the fight is over. Corrales with a remarkable dramatic turnaround to win this fight.
If he gets up, he probably wins the fight. I can't believe it!
Unbelievable! Richard Steele stopped the fight with fewer than 5 seconds to go. You're going to watch Lou Duva go crazy now. You're going to watch Lou Duva go absolutely berserk.
Hello Boxing Asylum listeners, and welcome to another edition of Punches from the Past, where we delve into boxing's rich history and discuss the fights that really mattered. I'm not your host, Steve Wellings. This is an open panel discussion for which I'm joined by David Lee, Andy Patterson and Kurt Ward to discuss the fight between Lennox Lewis and Vitali Klitschko. Guys, don't forget you can catch our previous episodes on the 2 De La Hoya Mosley fights over on iTunes, Tumblr or directly through the Facebook page. And while you're at it, please subscribe to the Asylum channel on YouTube, where we run regular live shows every Sunday evening. Now that's all out of the way, it's time to head back in time to the 21st of June 2003 and the Staples Center, Los Angeles, where Lennox Lewis edged his way past Vitali Klitschko by a 6th round stoppage. Our very own David Lee is now going to fill us in with the background, a little bit of the background and what was going on before the big heavyweight showdown. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So as you mentioned, this fight took place on June 21st, 2003 at the Staples Center. Now, just as I said, a bit of background behind this. The original plan, actually, for this date was a pay-per-view doubleheader featuring Lennox Lewis and Mike Tyson in separate bouts, with Lewis fighting Kirk Johnson and Tyson fighting Oleg Maskiev. And if both Lewis and Tyson had won their fights, they would meet later that year. Now, lost in all this was the aforementioned Vitali Klitschko, because Vitali was the #1 contender to lose his WBC title, and both men apparently had signed a deal in December of 2002 to fight in April of 2003. However, in January of 2003, Lewis announced his intentions of fighting Tyson, and let's be honest, it was a highly cynical mismatch that was unwarranted based on the first fight. You know, okay, the casual audience might want to see Lewis Tyson because, you know, those two names together would have sold. But everyone who watched the first fight knew there was no need for a rematch. But it was all motions go. It was all set to happen in 2003. Now, obviously, this didn't sit well with Vitali or his team. And Universum, who were Klitschko's management company, they threatened legal action against both Lewis and the WBC. Lewis, on the other hand, issued a countersuit against Vitali and the WBC for, quote-unquote, brokering a deal together for Lewis to defend his WBC title and Klitschko. Because Lewis's contention was that, you know, he had a contractual obligation to fight Tyson in a rematch, and a Klitschko fight would have interfered with that. But, you know, if that was true, why did he sign a deal to fight Klitschko in the first place back in December of 2002? You know, so that didn't really make sense. Now, in between all these threats of suits and counter-suits, Tyson, in the meantime, had backed out of the whole deal. He wasn't going to appear on the June 21st card. He didn't sign that contract, and he was no longer planning to fight Lewis at all. There was rumours that actually Don King, believe it or not, played somewhat of a role in that. Himself and Tyson had been involved in a lengthy lawsuit around that time period, and they had managed to come to some sort of agreement. And I remember reading at the time from Team Maskiev that they believed that King was in Tyson's ear at the time, and they were saying that, or King was, they believed King was saying that if Tyson had appeared on Lewis's undercard, he would be undervaluing himself. So I have no idea if that's true or not, but that's what Maskiev's team believed. So with Tyson off the card, the proposed pay-per-view was off, and the show was moved to regular HBO. As well as that, ticket slices at the Staples Center were slashed because the marquee name Tyson was off the card. Now, as part of an agreed deal that Lewis and Klitschko came to avoid any litigation, Vitali agreed to appear on the Lewis-Johnson undercard in a tune-up fight against the then unbeaten Cedric Boswell. If he had won that, he would have fought Lewis in December, providing Lewis had beaten Kirk Johnson. However, again, there was another twist in the tale, because Johnson tore a chest muscle in training, and he pulled out of the Lewis fight with only 2 weeks to go, which left Lewis and HBO scrambling to find a substitute and save the show. So, with 2 weeks to go, Lewis and Klitschko entered into negotiations to fight each other on that date. But there was a lot of doubts about that fight being financially viable. I mean, I know Kerry Davis, the then HBO vice president, immediately poured cold water on the two fighting, saying that without pay-per-view, it would be very unlikely that the financial demands of all parties would be met. But, the two eventually did agree to face each other, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that's just a brief background of how that fight came together.
Just to add to what Dave was saying, I actually managed to dig up some figures, just on the site problems as well as Dave mentioned about Tyson might be on the undercard. On that understanding, the site fee was offered by the Staples Center for $8 million, and then when Tyson dropped out, I think the site fee then fell to $3.4 million, and then with, you say, Kirk Johnson following it, I think the site fee was pulled all together. Now you think about what Lewis's purse was, I think it was something like $7 million. Klitschko got 1.4. The attendance announced was 15,939. Tickets sold 8,490. And that was according to the commission. Now, of those paid, 1,024 of them were discounted. So, tickets sold at full price was 7,466, and tickets given away for free was 4,868. With a gate of just over 2.5 million. So, you would think, Dave, that maybe they've lost money on that.
Yeah, you'd think so. Yeah, definitely.
Just going to add, actually, just as you mentioned about Mike Tyson was meant to be on that card, he was actually arrested on the Saturday morning. Now, if you go and watch the HBO broadcast of it, Bob Costas actually gives a kind of funny story on it, and this basically breaks it down as to how it happened and stuff. Basically, Tyson was arrested for fighting with two guys outside a Brooklyn hotel. And I think, as you say, Dave, it was I forget roughly when the rematch was meant to happen again, as you said though, but Tyson was basically saying he needed a tune-up fight, and then Costas obviously says that he says, well, hopefully the two guys he was fighting outside the hotel wasn't part of that tune-up. But was it that fight outside the hotel that caused him getting jailed for a second time?
Possibly. I'm not really sure. I remember Tyson getting jailed around that time period, but I can't remember exactly, when it was. But yeah, I mean, that the Lewis Tyson fight was talked about for June of 2003. But as you mentioned, then Tyson did say he wanted a couple of tune-ups first, and I think the plan was to have that tune-up fight and then fight Lewis to come to some agreement. Because actually, if you remember, before their first fight in 2002, not to go too off topic here, but Tyson wanted to fight Ray Mercer in January of 2002, and actually Lewis vetoed that. He said, no, you're not fighting Ray Mercer. If you fight Ray Mercer, the then April date of 2002 was off, later moved to June 8, 2002. But Tyson was definitely wanted a two-shot.
His IBF title as well. I remember going into the fight that I think the IBF had basically called for the Chris Bird mandatory.
Yes.
And then Lewis ended up vacating the title.
Yeah. See, I mean that's part of it as well. I mean, I don't want to steal Kurt's go as well, because I'm sure he has his say on this as well. But there's a lot of hypocrisy, all throughout Lewis's career, which kind of irks a lot of people, and it kind of annoys me as well. I mean, for years he complained about Riddick Bowe of dropping a title and freezing him out, and Mike Tyson did the same thing in '96. But he did the exact same thing during his career. I mean, it was a federal judge technically stripped him of the WBA title rather than fighting John Ruiz. And he dropped the title, dropped the IBF title rather than fighting Chris Bird. As mentioned in my brief summary of the background between Lewis and Klitschko, he pissed Klitschko around something rotten, when Klitschko was the WBC #1 contender. So, Lewis was guilty of the same things that Lewis complained that the likes of Bowe and Tyson were doing, just
Same with the talks for the rematch, wasn't it? Same for talks for the rematch.
Same with talks for the rematch. I mean, that lingered on until about February 2004, when Lewis eventually announced his retirement, so the exact same things he criticised the likes of Bowe, Tyson for, he did the same thing himself. I mean, and you can argue until the cows come home about the merits of Ruiz and Bird as challengers, but the fact of the matter is they fought their way into a mandatory position. And, Lewis is saying that the likes of Ruiz and Bird weren't viable or worthy contenders, but he defended these titles against the likes of Franz Botha. And at the time, Rackman eventually did cause the upset, but when Lewis Rackman was announced, I mean, that fight was derided by everyone, because Rackman at the time he was coming off a knockout to Maskev. So he hadn't warranted a title shot.
I think it's for fans who are listening and maybe haven't been fans for a long time. It's like interesting to see, how the media and how fans looked at Vitali Klitschko into the fight, because now, you'll say, him along with his brother and Lennox Lewis were the dominant heavyweight champions of the past 15 years. Passed on to each other. But at the time, going into that fight, let's be honest, people give Lennox Lewis credit for taking that fight on at short notice, but he and the majority of boxing experts looked at that fight as an easy fight for Lennox Lewis. Vitali was seen as just a lumbering oaf, basically, the less talented brother. It was Vladimir Klitschko who HBO was basic. What they're doing with Golovkin now, Vladimir Klitschko was the same kind of guy. He was the darling of HBO. He was the one they were trying to push into a Lennox Lewis fight. They were showing all his fights. He was fighting a few American guys, and he was crossing over to Germany and America to fight. And it was only when he lost to Corey Sanders that basically ended a chance of a Lennox Lewis fight. But Vitali was seen as the lesser brother, and he was the guy who he'd only had 2 names in his record going into the Lewis fight: Herbie Hyde and Chris Bird, and both of those guys obviously huge disadvantages in size, power next to the guy. And one of those fights he lost, and the fight that he lost was actually shown on HBO to Chris Bird, where he was winning, but he pulled out of a shoulder injury, and he was basically booed out of the arena by his own fans. Larry Merchant really gave him a lot of stick that night. If you watch the fight, he really, and basically no one thought he had the stomach or the heart for a fight. It's hard to, again, hindsight, but if you think of Klitschko now, whatever you think of him, he's a hard fucker. But at the time, going into that fight, he was seen as, when the going gets tough, he'll get going. And so Lennox Lewis picked that fight, and he had to take the fight really, because when Kurt Johnson was injured, he had no option. He didn't, at that stage of his career, I don't think Lennox Lewis wanted to cancel the fight and then fight Vitali 4 or 5 months down the line, more training, more waiting around. He thought he could get rid of the mandatory then set his sights on a Mike Tyson rematch, a Roy Jones fight, which is laughable. And it's just a money-making fight. And yeah, so going into that fight, I think, Vitali was taking a massive step up, and Lennox Lewis, I think, did the same kind of thing he did with Hasim Rahman. He thought this guy was an absolute joke, and he'd beat the heart out of him pretty easily. And as we all get into the fight, it didn't turn out that way.
I think, guys, just coming off the back of Kurt's point there, actually, it's a good one. I'm wondering what you guys think about the physical condition in that case that Lennox Lewis came in, because he was coming towards the end of his career, obviously, which was borne out afterwards, the fact that he retired after Klitschko without giving him a rematch, but he came in the heaviest of his career. This was his 18th world heavyweight title fight in total, and he'd knocked out Rahman in the rematch, he'd knocked out Tyson, so he was on reasonable enough form coming into this one. But he tried to avoid Klitschko, but then he took the risk, and I give him credit for that. But the fact of the matter was, despite whatever he says and whatever Emmanuel Stewart says, he wasn't in good physical condition. He clearly was blowing. He was throwing the big shots from the start. He wanted to get Klitschko out there because I don't think he trusted his stamina. He just looked like a guy who had one foot in the door to retirement, and he just wasn't fit, despite what he said at the end. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree with that, Steve. And I'd also, I'd agree with Kurt's point as well. That I do give Lewis. You have to give Lewis credit for taking the risk of fighting Klitschko. I think was it 10 days out to come to an agreement to fight. But I also think it was somewhat of a calculating move by Lewis because he had to fight Klitschko anyway. They had a deal in place to fight in December of that year. That was a legally binding thing to avoid any pending lawsuits by Team Klitschko. So I think in Lewis's mind, Klitschko agreed to fight on the undercard to Lewis. Well, it was then Lewis Johnson around May. So that was it was only a few weeks before the Lewis Klitschko fight took place. So it wasn't a full training camp by Vitali, whereas Lewis was supposedly in training for a fight with Kirk Johnson. That fight was announced back in March. So he had a full training camp. Now, as you said, what he was doing in that training camp, I have no idea. Maybe playing chess for all those weeks, I have no idea.
He knew he was going to bang Johnson out, basically, like we all knew.
That's it, yeah. Lewis is what, 18 stone, 4.5? Crazy weight. But, there were some people at the time who were saying that it was a calculating move by Lewis to weigh in that much as well, because they said that Lewis was always better against bigger men. We saw him against some Michael Grant, what he did to Michael Grant, and that Lewis with the extra weight would be more powerful. But I think most wise boxing analysts would have raised a few eyebrows. I know I did at the time. Lewis being so heavy, and he didn't look cut either. He did look flabby. So he definitely wasn't in tip-top shape. Klitschko, the consummate professional, I think he was only. I think he was consistent enough. I don't remember his weight at the time, but I think it was consistent enough, maybe 2 or 3 pounds above. But he looked ripped. Klitschko's are always in shape, aren't they? They're the consummate professionals. They're always in the gym. Whereas Lewis, as you said, coming towards the end of his career, how seriously was he taking the proposed Kirk Johnson fight? It's the way it suggests he wasn't training at full throttle.
Well, he took his foot off the gas, hadn't he, Andy, against Hasim Rahman in South Africa. He was coming in against Johnson, who was a small guy. He'd been found out in his only title opportunity. I remember, wasn't it John Ruiz? He got disqualified for low blows. He'd been found out, Johnson. Lewis knew what he was going to get, and I think that was the reason behind it. He was skipping in training, I think.
Yeah, the thing is, as well as me, I think when it was all said and done, Lewis walked away with something like $150 million or something in earnings. So you can understand if he's obviously his heart's not at 38-year-old, been on top for so many years, 18 title defences. But if you think about it as well, 2 years before he was basically saying that Vitali had no heart, he's not got the heart of a champion. He wouldn't have quit against Bird to be carried out in a stretcher. Basically saying that he would have Vitali for breakfast and then Vladimir for lunch and stuff. But you're right. He was definitely out of shape. If you look at the first 2 rounds of the fight, if you look at Lewis's jab over his career, it was always sharp. He just, especially in the first round, it looked like he was just basically pushing his punches out. There was just no snap whatsoever. I even thought that Vitali even maybe out jabbed him the first few rounds, and then. Just going into round 2, that's where I think that is where the fight just basically turned into an absolute dogfight, because obviously that early there was. I know the guys are going to talk about the right hand, but there were actually 2 right hands that actually landed before that. I think it was like a solid right hand early in the round, and there was one like 30 seconds later. With under 2 minutes left, he's basically he had another stiff right hand, and Lewis was badly rocked. But if you look at the end of that second round as well, when it came down to the actual part, if Lewis was sharp enough, and he did at times, when he was sharp enough with a jab, he absolutely stunned Klitschko. And if you look at the end of the second round, actually, even though it was a clear round for Klitschko, he actually had him basically on slightly wobbly legs with a jab.
Yeah, there was a stiff jab, you're right, Andy, near the end of the round, which definitely buckled Vitali's legs. But I think as well, what caused Lewis problems was Vitali. Okay, he's not the most graceful of boxers. Speaking classically, of how boxers look, but he's definitely got he definitely had like a very awkward style, and I think Lewis had problems kind of figuring him out. As you said, like I mean, Lewis, he was all over the place at times, wasn't he? He was missing widely with shots, and his balance was awful at times. I'm sure the weight didn't help as well, but
It was
and
windy.
as you said,
It was basically winded after that second round. He just never really recovered because he was flat-footed. He just stood there and just slugged it out.
He'd been out the ring for a year as well at that point, hadn't he?
Out the ring for a year, and as Andy was saying there, I mean, he was gasping for air at times, and I think one of the big problems Lewis had in that fight, Lewis was always, in all these fights throughout his career, he was always the physically stronger man in the ring. I mean, his physical strength was immense, and he used to always bully fighters, by leaning on top. It was one of his tactics. He'd always lean on fighters, sap their energy. But I think in this fight, he actually met his physical equal, because Vitali was very, very strong, and at times when they were up close in clinches, Vitali was actually pushing Lewis around, pushing him back and bullying him. I think that shook Lewis mentally, as it was the first time I think in Lewis's career that he'd had that happen to him.
It's crazy though. Sorry, Kurt. It's crazy that Lewis did come in that shape. I mean, obviously as well, he was preparing for another fight, but at the same time as he, I don't know if he probably knew that Klitschko was coming down the line at some point, so he knew. It was expected by the camp basically that against physically imposing guys bigger than him or maybe the same size as Lewis, he actually was more aggressive. He did start the fight quite aggressive, but then he got quickly shut down again. As I say, he was slow with his punches and stuff. But you just wondered if basically underestimated the actual strength of the guy, because we'll get into the guts of the fight itself. But there was times, as you say, when Klitschko was hurt, he was still able to force Lewis back.
Yeah, and he was making Lewis work as well. And as you say, I mean, Lewis was breathing heavy a lot. And yeah, I just think that Klitschko's awkward style. I mean, I just think Lewis had problems kind of adapting to that. Now, as you said, we'll get more into the fight in a bit. I think Lewis was starting to maybe figure out Klitschko, but he was so tired in that fight, wasn't he? And we'll get to what would have happened if the cut hadn't forced a stoppage in a little bit. But he was just so tired in that fight, Lewis, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think just bringing Kurt in. Sorry, Dave, I was going to say just bringing Kurt in there. I mean, as good a time as any to get into the fight. Andy's mentioned the first couple of rounds. I was going to ask Kurt actually, considering some of the hellacious punches that Lewis took in the first couple of rounds. Do we think that that answered the questions that it dogged him throughout his career about his chin? I mean, some of the punches Vitali caught him with, there was nothing wrong with his chin from what I could see.
No, I think the shot in the second round really hurt him, and I think he stunned him for a while, and I think he took him a while to really come around for that. Even maybe the next round he was still hurt from it because he looked very sloppy afterwards.
Taking this at 2 weeks' notice and gets him with the right hand, and Lewis wants to hold. He's hurt by that. He wanted a hold. Klitschko has got him a bit wobbly here. Lewis is in trouble here in round 2.
The fact that he took it, he was knocked out, and I think that's an unfair label at Lewis. I mean, when big guys hit you on the chin, let's be fair, the shot that Hasim Rahman hit him with, Rahman could punch. Yeah, he shouldn't have been hit with a punch like that, a guy of his, quality, but he did, and once you get caught with a shot like that, you're going to go down. It's same with McCall. I mean, he was sloppy when he got caught with that punch, that right hand as well. So, the fact is, Klitschko, he's not the puncher his brother is, but he's still a big man and he can still punch, and he's more of an accommodative puncher who breaks down, but that punch he caught him square on the button. I mean, it was a perfect landing where it hit, and Lewis took it, and I think he took a lot of big shots, and we know Vitali's got a great chin. I think unfairly Lewis gets a lot of stick for his chin, but I think his chin is good, and it showed in this fight. It showed in other fights as well, but yeah, you got a good chin, and I think in terms of Vitali, I think he surprised Lewis the way he fought, because I think if you look at Klitschko's style, he's a bit of a weird style. You can see why people look at him as like a bit of a lumbering oaf. He's got that same Primo Chimera kind of style where he leans back as he jabs, and he doesn't look like he's just weird. His footwork's not very good, but it's effective, and I think Lewis was expecting him to be a bit back off, try and stay on the outside. But I think he surprised him by looking to land big punches early, and I think Lewis was surprised by that, and also the fact that Klitschko just wasn't intimidated. Like I said, now we know that's Vitali Klitschko, but at the time I think people were expecting him to crumble. At the big fight against Lewis. The fans now, it's hard to believe that, but at the time, after the Chris Bird performance, he was so heavily criticised, and when a guy quits on his stall because of an arm injury, when he's ahead in the fight against a guy, 40 pounds lighter than him who can't punch very hard, questions obviously asked, but I think he regrets that now, and it was a mistake, but he proved more than in this fight that he had all the heart, and he's as tough as they come.
He took a decision, didn't he, against Bird? I think it was his rotator cuff that went. I think he took a decision about the longevity of his career. Not that I want to segue off into that, but I think he made the right decision in that case, because his brother gave Bird a beating. He went on to have a long, illustrious career where he showed that he had the heart. I think that was a calculating decision. At the time, I can understand why people, including the Americans, criticised him for it. But in hindsight, I think he made the right decision against Bird quitting, quote unquote.
Take it easy, take it easy. Is it hurting?
It's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. Er macht gar nicht mehr, ist vorbei.
Okay, it's over. We are giving up.
Komm, ist okay.
It hurts too much.
Gut. Es geht, es geht nicht.
No, it's okay. Don't worry.
Wait a minute.
They're stopping it. They are. That's exactly what Cornelius Winter just told us.
I can't believe what I've just seen.
Vitali Klitschko elects not to go on with his left hand apparently too damaged to continue, and Chris Bird gets a victory. Chris Bird, taking a fight on 10 days' notice, retrieves a portion of what he lost last year against Ike Ibeabuchi. Vitali Klitschko stunningly and mysteriously dropping out of a fight in which he appeared headed toward an easy victory.
He doesn't have the mentality of a champion. I can hardly believe what I just saw. You have a bad hand, so what?
I couldn't believe my ears when I heard interpreter Cornelius Winter repeating what he heard out of Klitschko's corner, but indeed, it was a perfect interpretation. He was exactly right. Klitschko and his team deciding not to go.
He said he actually tore the rotator cuff in the 4th round of that fight, and you know how Lewis basically says, "Oh, he's not got a champion to fight on." As you say, Larry Merchant, Dave, at the start of the show, he'd actually gave him jip for it as well. But I suppose if it's truly done it in the 4th round, he's lasted till the 10th. I don't think you can basically question his heart.
He said the pain was unreal, and I mean you can only imagine what it was. I mean, for a man like Vitali to say that, I mean it must have been absolutely blinding, the pain. I mean, and he just said to fight on for about 4 or 5 more rounds. I mean that just tells you the character of the man in itself.
And you got to think as well, he quit in that fight when he said the pain was unreal, and you can understand the criticism, but he's got one of the worst cuts I've ever seen in boxing. And he's got a man like almost 260-pound Lennox Lewis punching him on that eye. The fight could have been stopped in the 3rd round, in all honesty. But you've got a guy like Lennox Lewis punching him in the head on that same spot. And at the end of the fight, when it fight's over, what's he saying? He's screaming no, no, and he wants to fight on. So I think it was just a freak accident. In both his losses, he was unfortunate, really, wasn't he?
Well, as you say, sorry, Dave, when you go, mate.
Oh, sorry, Andy. Yeah, just on Kurt's point there. I mean, he made a very good point. About Klitschko's possibly freezing on the big stage, because I know that was a talk at the time from Team Lewis. They genuinely believed that Klitschko would crumble under the big stage. So I mean, I think that may have played a factor as well in Lewis taking the fight, because they saw this guy Klitschko. He'd been fighting in probably the 2nd division, to be fair. I mean, outside of Herbie Hyde. Bird fight, which you just mentioned, and maybe Larry Donald.
Vaughan Bean, yeah, it was the 2nd division, wasn't it? He was fighting.
Yeah, Vaughan Bean, second tier, heavyweight. He hadn't fought anywhere near this level of fighter in Lewis, who was still an outstanding champion. Obviously, past his best, still an outstanding champion. And also, there was talks.
Yeah, go on.
There was talks, as you said, Kurt, that Klitschko would crumble under the big pressure, the big spotlight of such a big fight.
Yeah, and I think what made Lewis more confident is seeing the more talented or supposed talented brother getting destroyed by Corey Sanders 3 months earlier. Well, if that's the more talented brother, what's this guy going to be like? You know, and I think that's...
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, he was heavily favoured, Lewis, going into it. As you say, I mean, there was no substance to Klitschko's resume at that time as well. But just going back to the fight, I mean, even though, you know, as I say, he won the second round, Klitschko, and then as Kurt mentioned, the cut happened in the third round. It was a very bad cut, but at the same time, as you know, Lewis was still on steady legs, but you know, he came out there and he actually he tried to put it on him, and it did turn into a bit of a street fight, a kind of barroom brawl. You know, some toe-to-toe action in there. You know, with some good right hands. I did think that maybe Lewis probably just shaded that round, but I just
The third round, is it?
Yeah, the third round, yeah.
Yeah, I gave that round to Lewis. There's the only 2 rounds I gave to Lewis for the third round, and obviously the last round as well.
He got the jab and the left hook going, didn't he, in the third round? I think before, obviously,
He did, and I think
the cut happened.
He should was calling for the left hook as well, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was getting it. I think he landed it late on in that round, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the cut.
The left hand, sorry Dave, the left hand, it sort of slashed through with like a thumb follow through, and it really slashed the eye open, Dave. I mean, it was one of the worst cuts, if not the worst cut I think I've ever seen.
Well, the punch was odd, wasn't it?
He was leaning back, wasn't he, Klitschko? It was like,
it was right at the start of the round. If you look at it, it was a 3-punch combination. I'm sure it was the right hand.
It was a right hand, but it was like the wrist, or near the wrist.
It's maybe just came up like the palm of the glove.
Followed
maybe
through,
with the laces, maybe.
I like the laces, and because it kind of slapped off Klitschko's eye, and you could see by the shape of the cut as well. It wasn't your typical cut that's caused by a punch. You know, it's like a T. It's like a T over Vitali's left eye.
Otherwise, it might signal the end of his hopes in the fight. He looks dispirited all of a sudden. Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible.
A really, really bad cut.
Oh, a horrible gash, which might signal the end of the fight. Is he going to be able to carry on with that?
And the gloves looked odd as well, didn't they? Was there red tape around the gloves? There wasn't the traditional white tape around the gloves. I don't even know if there was tape.
I've noticed about California fights, actually, they seem to use blue and red tape for actually taping up the gloves.
Yeah, so there may have been like some sort of like jagged edge around Lewis's glove or something, but it didn't look like a typical punch. It was like a slashing type punch, kind of like a freak shot, but it opened and it
kind of deflected off. It maybe like deflected, but maybe just kind of brought the wrist into that part of the eye.
It did, yeah, and but it opened up an horrendous cut. I mean, it's probably. I don't know what you guys think, but probably like the worst cut I've ever seen.
I think it was the worst one, yeah. I think it was the worst one I've ever seen. I mean, afterwards, Sky Sports interviewed the ringside physician afterwards, and he said to the camera,
the corner people did a very good job in controlling the bleeding throughout the fight. The problem was not the blood. Usually 95-99% of the time it's because a cut is bleeding into the eye and the boxer is unable to see. In this particular case, the lid was detached to a point that he needed to tilt his head to be able to see, therefore wouldn't be able to see, pick up a punch that would come, such like a hook. So there was no other option in that case, even though he may have felt okay, even though he may feel as though that he could have adapted to the situation, he wouldn't have cleared under any criteria to be able to continue.
Because I remember the Sky commentary were very critical of the cutsmen in the corner, but Jesus Christ, what could we do?
At first they were, but then afterwards, I think Ian Dark actually went back on that and started to say he thought Joe Souza was doing a good job. I was going to ask you guys, actually, what do you think?
Sorry, Andy, they stopped the blood in the fourth round, didn't they? They actually stopped the blood flow, but in the fifth round again, Lewis was landing continuously around that side of Klitschko's face. He opened up a couple of more cuts and reopened that wound, and the blood just started flowing profusely then.
When the cut happened, I think George Foreman on the HBO broadcast, he said someone's bleeding. I think Lampley initially said it was Lennox Lewis.
Yeah.
And then it became obvious it was Klitschko, but you just think he's still fighting normally. He's not really wiping his face. You just think, oh, it's not a bad cut. He's just, caught a punch, obviously. Then when he sits down on his stool and HBO's camera zooms in, I think everyone just thinks, oh my God, you know, and it's a terrible cut. And I think if you read the New York Times afterwards, they interviewed the plastic surgeon, and he said it was 60 stitches on 5 cuts, 4 on his face and 1 in his mouth. I mean, it just tells you all of it. I mean, and the fact is, the fight could have been stopped then if a lot of referees would have looked over there and said this can't continue. I mean, it's a gaping wound. That's the only wound we can see, but he's obviously got 3 or 4 other cuts around his face as well. And I mean, he can see, but I mean, it's just a horrible gash, and you got to think the guy is obviously going to go for it as well. He's going to try and land punches on it, and I mean, it is the worst cut I think I've seen, and it's a shame because the fight was. I mean, can you think another great heavyweight fights, since then between two, what you'd say top heavyweights? I mean, we've seen, good fights between lesser competition, but 2 top guys like that.
I think anybody just talking about bad eye cuts and stuff. Anybody remember Izzy Vasquez in the 4th fight against Rafael Marquez?
Yes, Israel Vasquez, yeah.
That was pretty horrid. That one.
He's paid the price for it now, hasn't he?
And it wasn't a cut, but Margarito's against Pacquiao's, man. I mean, still, you can still see it now, all these years later, what he did to him.
Edwin Valero, although it was an eye cut, if you look at, remember Edwin Valero against Tony DeMarco, it was right at the top of the hairline. I don't know if anybody remember seen that. I think that was horrible.
Well, one of the categorising factors I think about the cut is obviously, is it bleeding into the eye? And I mean, this one, it was bleeding into the eye from every single angle. I think but the thing was with Klitschko though, after that in the 4th, it didn't deter him. He actually got busy in the 4th round, and Lewis seemed to be blowing again. Yep,
definitely. I mean, I thought if you look at the 4th round, Lewis is basically following him, round about the ring. Just going back to the cut itself, Joe Souza did everything he could. I mean, he's in there with a Q-tip just trying to stem the blood flow. If you look at the actual eyelid, in the 6th round, which we'll get to, it's literally hanging off. There's nothing else he could do with it apart from put like say a bit of tape on it as a kind of temporary stitch, which he wouldn't have been allowed to do in a fight. The reasonable thing was to stop the fight, but again, you think to yourself, you've got a fighter here who's actually winning the fight. How far do you let it go on? It's one of those things. It's fights like that. Actually, it makes you test your actual true love and how sick you are actually. Because
Yeah, exactly. Does anybody dispute the stoppage? First of all, I mean, anyone think that it should have been allowed to continue?
No.
I don't think so either. I don't think so.
I think Klitschko fans get in. They say, oh, it's a bad stoppage. The thing is, the fight should have been stopped. What is the annoying and frustrating thing is there should have been a rematch. That's the annoying thing. The fact is, the rematch would have settled it with 2 guys who were both training for each other. The fight was legitimately stopped. It could have been stopped after 3 rounds. I think the Cutsman did the best job he could, and I think he did a fine job. I mean, some of the rounds, it weren't looking as bad. It weren't bleeding as bad as it was. But then, obviously, when you're getting punched, it's going to start again. But I think my problem was with Klitschko's corner was Fritz Aduni. I don't think there was any urgency in his corner. I think he should have looked at that cut and said, Vitali, you've got to knock this guy out. You'll have a few rounds maximum. You've just got to blast this guy out. He's tired. He's lumbering all over the place. He's there for the taking. The ref's not going to let you continue. You've got to go and blast him out. And there was none of that. It was all like, work behind the jab, throw the right hand, keep out of it. He's right. It was like, yeah, we're going to win on points. And yeah, I could see them winning on points. I think Lewis won that fight, but the guy's got the worst cut you've seen. They're not going to let it go on. He can't go 12 rounds with it. But there seemed no urgency at all. It was just like they could win the fight on points, they believed, even with the cut, and it was just never going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the question was put after round 5, or during round 5. I think even Foreman maybe even commented on the HBO broadcast that Lewis is ready to go, ready to be taken, and then Jim Lampley popped up and says, just put the question out there. Could Vitali finish the fight with that eye? And the Merchant just, as he did so many times in the past, just put a wee comment in there, kept it straight, and just says, Jim, I don't think, it looks like to me both couldn't finish the fight. They were fucked after round 5.
Vitali was very tired, but I think Lewis in particular was absolutely exhausted.
Yeah,
I mean, so. the telling thing for me, just to fast forward to the end of the fight, the telling thing for me was, at the end of the 6th round, Lewis collapsed on his stool. He didn't sit down. He absolutely collapsed. His legs collapsed from under him. He was exhausted. Now, when the fight was stopped, Klitschko immediately jumped up and was running around the ring. on the opposite side of the corner, Lewis was still collapsing. He's still gasping for air. I'm even wondering, could he have even got off his stool for the 7th round?
And it's such a great fight. It was such an unsatisfactory ending as well. I mean, like you said, Lennox Lewis didn't look like a winner. I mean, I know Vitali had the huge cut, but he was getting cheered from the crowd. His fists were raised. He was, getting on the rope, celebrating. Lewis just looked dejected, as if, yeah, I got away with it, but I haven't. That's not a satisfaction, and that's why I'm surprised he retired on that, because, if you think of someone like, even someone like Carl Froch retiring on, that punch against Groves, it's a perfect ending for him. But I think with Lewis, he was like, I got away with it, and I don't really fancy that again, to be honest. I'm at my age, and I don't fancy another training camp against this guy, and I think he knew he got away with it, but he didn't look happy, and I think his post-fight interview showed that, how angry he was. He seemed very bitter for a guy who's just defended his title and won.
Yeah.
He seemed like he'd the one who's got got stopped on a cut or stopped on a technicality kind of thing.
The way he reacted at the end. But as I say, if you go to the 6th, the eyelid was basically hanging off, and I thought Vitali started it pretty well. The 6th, then like Lewis was forcing himself forward. And if you watch it, Vitali standing, straight. He just basically square on, and he just kind of letting kind of wee silly pity pat punches out, and then, as I said, he kind of leans forward, and it's probably one of the greatest right uppercuts I've ever seen.
Uppercut, yeah.
Honestly, I mean, it was like a gun. It was like a starter's pistol going off in the Olympics. The way Klitschko fell into it, he just kind of dropped his head a little bit, and Lewis, it was just more like I don't know if it was a desperation punch, but he just unleashed it. Honestly, Christ, and the crowd noise is anybody else. I think any heavyweight today would probably just would have collapsed, folded off that punch. A great right uppercut.
Times in his head. Oh, what an uppercut from Lewis! Absolute peach! But Klitschko took that too without going down. That was right out of the textbook from Lennox.
That was really the punch of the fight. Uppercut.
That might have been a fight-ending punch on another night. But Klitschko's showing his bottle here, isn't he, now?
He really is. With such damage, he's still around the eye, he's still fighting, he's took some good shots, but he's still trying to work hard.
It was a similar uppercut, Andy, to the one he decimated Michael Grant with, wasn't it? And we saw how Grant reacted to that. But Klitschko somehow stood upright after taking it. I don't know how he did it, but I mean, as I said, he did lean forward, but he did stay upright. The legs didn't go. I mean, he was hurt, obviously. He hung on, but how he stayed upright, I'll never know. It was unbelievable uppercut.
And I just think it's great when you watch this fight back, and hopefully the listeners watch it back, and people who maybe never watched it before watch it back. But to see a heavyweight fight in the United States as well, with the crowd into it, as if it, the heavyweight division has produced a lot of stinkers from the top guys over the years, but to see two big guys going at it and the crowd are just so into it, you said it's like a barroom brawl, and the crowd just wanted more, and it's just great to see, and it's a shame that we don't see more of that, and that's why the heavyweight division has become less of interest to a lot of people, sadly.
You say the at that time was the most. Sorry, Dave. She's just going. I know we're going to get in the aftermath of the fight, maybe Lewis's retirement and stuff, but at that time Lewis still wasn't being respected at that time, and I still okay, Tyson's well past it. They still. Going into that fight, Klitschko was very, very underrated.
I think it just drifting into the post-fight, actually, guys. I think Ian Darke on Sky Sports summed up Lennox Lewis's display quite well. I thought he said, Lewis showed championship quality, but this is not a fighter at his peak anymore. This is around the age that Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali came apart at the seams. I'm not saying Lewis really came apart at the seams. That's too strong of an assessment. But I think Darke saw that the writing was on the wall. And as I said at the beginning, the fact that Lewis didn't fight again, like Kurt says, I just don't think he had the stomach for the camp, and I'm not holding that against him as a criticism, because he was a great champion, he had a great career, but he just walked away with his money and he didn't want to fight Klitschko again, which is unsatisfactory, but that's his prerogative at the end of the day.
It is his prerogative, but I mean, as Kurt said, I mean, it's not exactly the best way for a champion to go, is it? I mean, I think it left more questions than answers. And as Andy said as well, I mean, Klitschko didn't really get the respect he was due either. I mean, he fought Kirk Johnson at the end of the year in an eliminator, and there was lots of talks of Johnson having to beat the Klitschko, believe it or not. They said that Joe Johnson had the speed and to cause problems, and Johnson was talented. But like Lennox Lewis, I think Kirk Johnson came in a terrible weight as well, didn't he? I mean, he was grossly overweight. Didn't look like he trained a lick for that fight. And
Vitali destroyed him, didn't he? Didn't he destroy him?
Dispatched him in about 2 rounds effortlessly. Johnson was in terrible shape.
I think Vladimir actually, Dave, played quite a key role at the end of the fight. I think just talking about the in-ring shenanigans, obviously things got a little bit, I wouldn't say nasty, it got a bit pantomime, everyone started pushing and shoving. Lennox seemed quite reserved, he was relieved it was over. Vladimir actually sort of calmed Vitali down a little bit. Vitali was running around the ring shouting 9-9, and I thought Vladimir did quite a good job actually.
Yeah. Well, what happened was, if I remember correctly, Vitali went over to Lewis and said rematch. And Lewis didn't really give him an answer. He actually turned his back when Vitali said that. And that really seemed to annoy Klitschko. And I think he got his glove and started smacking Lewis in the shoulder a few times. And
he started saying, "You promise," or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Camera. He wanted him to look at the camera and say there was going to be a rematch, I think.
Yeah, when Lewis turned his back, Klitschko said, look at me. And he wouldn't look at him. And Vitali then punched him a couple of times in the shoulder and had to pull Vitali away. I mean, Vitali, he's a gentleman outside the ring and a really cool guy. But he's a bit of a hothead when the going gets tough. I mean, even when Corey Sanders knocked out Vladimir, he got a bit animated as well, I think.
Even when Kiev's on flames, he's fucking walking through fucking black clouds to do war, man.
Oh, those photos, man, are boss. They really are.
He's not the type of guy you just fuck with, is he really? Let's be honest. But I think, David mentioned there about Vitali not getting any respect. Let's be honest, even after that fight he is still shit on. And it's incredible to believe now, when he fought Danny Williams, Boxing Monthly ran a poll, and Danny Williams, with boxing experts, and they picked Danny Williams to beat Vitali Klitschko.
Yeah.
And so,
beat down.
Graham Houston actually said it was a 50-50 fight, and that he had no idea who was going to win. I mean, I couldn't believe. We don't want to go too off topic, but I guess that's what we do as well, isn't it? But it's hard to believe now that people saw that anything other than a one-sided mismatch. But if you read a lot of the hype, a lot of the press leading into Klitschko Williams, a lot of people thought Williams could beat Klitschko. I couldn't believe it at the time. To me, it was going to be a one-sided massacre, and that's what turned out to be.
I think Steve's point as well. I think about Lewis retiring and it being, he's right to do that, which is fine. I'd have no problem with retiring, but I think he's constant. He was desperate for the Mike Tyson rematch. Now people say, a lot of them don't like the Klitschko's. They'll say, well, why should he give him Vitali a rematch? He beat him, But he wanted desperately to fight Mike Tyson again. That fight was not competitive for 1 minute. Mike Tyson was 12 years shot at that time, would lose to Danny Williams, a year or two later. And, he wanted that rematch. He wanted Roy Jones, a former middleweight, it would be like 60 pounds less than him in the ring. Roy Jones, as great as he was, but can you imagine them two in the ring together, standing next to each other? He wanted that fight, yet he didn't want Vitali, and he kept saying different things. He didn't say after that fight, maybe I'll give him a rematch, but I'm more thinking about retirement. He was saying Mike Tyson, Roy Jones, and he was saying, I might give him a rematch, but let's see if he gets his eye cleared first. He gets his eye cleared. Okay, let's fight at the end of the year. Oh no, I'm not going to fight at the end of the year. I'm going to take a break. So then Vitali takes on Kirk Johnson on that supposed day, knocks him out in 2 rounds. And then they're still waiting, and then like 2 months later he says, oh no, I'm going to retire. So he dragged it out for a long time. And I think, let's be honest, if Mike Tyson said, yeah, I want a rematch, that rematch would have happened. I think if Roy Jones, I don't think we had any intention of going next to Lennox Lewis, but if Roy Jones had somehow said, yeah, I'll take you on, I think that fight would have happened too. It
would have done, Kurt, because I think that it sounds laughable now, but at the time, Adrian Ogan, the business manager of Lennox's company, Lion Promotions, I think he was a much maligned figure towards the end. I don't think he exactly did the very best of jobs, but I'll leave that to one side. He stated that they were very much in negotiations with Roy Jones at the moment, even though we have received an offer from Universum for the Klitschko rematch. They were serious about that Jones fight. That wasn't a joke.
Yeah, but Jones was chasing Tyson, wasn't it? And then Tyson says he ended up in jail.
Yeah. I don't think Jones was ever seriously going to consider fighting Lennox Lewis.
No.
I think, and he just said it there, it was the Tyson fight he was after. Would have been a great freak show, but it never happened. Who do you know? Who do you know his name was thrown into the Roy Jones mix? Believe it or not, Corey Sanders. That fight was talked about for a bit as well.
Oof.
Oh, one punch from him.
Say,
Jones won the World Cup.
You know what? You know how I just mentioned Bob Costas at the start of the show there. You know, just sign off with what HBO said. You know, Larry Merchant having a tug of war with a microphone with Lennox. Quite funny stuff. You were telling us a wee kind of funny story. I mean, he was absolutely raging there, wasn't he?
Lewis with Merchant.
Aye.
Oh, big time. I mean, Merchant had this innate gift of just getting under fighters' skin, and he just did that with Lewis after the Klitschko fight. I mean, I think Merchant opened up the post-fight interview with saying to Lewis,
Congratulations, Lennox. You said that he had no skill level and that he had no heart. What do you say now?
Well, you know, if the fight would have went more, they should have stopped.
No, the fight didn't go more. What happened in the 6 rounds? What is your impression of him now?
It's okay. Hey, what do you want me to say?
I want you to say what you say. Was it a harder fight than you anticipated?
No, not really. You know, I was getting to him. There's no way he could have finished the fight. If you look at the state of his face, there's no way. He's lucky the fight was stopped. I was just getting to him, and he was just deteriorating anyway. So I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm just asking you for your impressions because you seem to dismiss him that he could even compete with you.
Well, yeah, of course he can compete with me. That's why he's here in the #1 position.
Well, I understand you were behind on all the judges' scorecards.
Listen, he would have got knocked out the next couple of rounds. It was just a matter of time. He was definitely deteriorating. So I don't even know what you're talking about, Larry.
Well, I'm telling you what the score is.
Huh?
I'm just telling you what the scoring of the officials was.
Oh, okay. So anyway, the referee's lucky he stopped the fight. Anyway, look at the state of his face.
Yeah, I think that irked Merchant, though, the fact that he was just so not giving him any credit. If Lewis had said, you know, well, yeah, this guy was a lot better than I thought, he's a good fighter, maybe Merchant wouldn't have gone as aggressive, but as soon as he went on the defensive and was saying, oh, this guy's a joke, I would have knocked him out whenever I wanted, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, and he even said one thing like, Merchant said to him, Vitali's got cheered and you've got booed, and he said something like, I don't agree with that, Larry, when the crowd is still, you know, booing in the background.
That was strange, wasn't it?
Oh, I don't want to. Dave telling a story about remember Rahman knocked him out. Dave, what did he say after the fight? He said, "I want a rematch to show him better."
He goes. It was actually BBC who interviewed Lewis because they covered that fight live.
Yeah.
And Lewis was like, "Oh, I want an immediate rematch because there's no way this guy can beat me." It was like, "Yeah, he just did." Then he just knocked you out. Believe me, I just saw the footage. He knocked you clean out. Yeah. But I mean, I don't want to turn this into a complete Lewis bastion as much as I'm tempted to. But you know, a lot of the times in post-fight interviews, he could be just so graceless, just saying stupid things, not giving any credit to the other guy.
That's the thing, and he also said, like, you know, this guy couldn't handle a dogfight, and I think I thought the same thing. And then Larry asked him, well, when were you in dogfights? Like, I mean, this was a guy who chose to jab to death, you know, a 250-pound tub of lard in David Tua instead of engaging in a fight when he could have probably knocked him out. It's just, you know, Lewis, a lot like, you know, the younger Klitschko brother, played it safe, used, you know, his attributes, which, you know, he's totally fine to do, but he was coming on like he was, you know, some you know, warrior who was in dogfights, and, you know, you just can't really think of any, you know, I mean, so, you know, just call it out it is. And I think the punch in the second round was still playing on his mind then, because he wasn't talking a lot of sense, and he really came off as a bad, you know, he sounds like a bad loser, and he actually won the fight, and, you know, it's strange comments, really.
He was immediately on the defensive, and I think that tells you a lot. I mean, why would a winner be on the defensive?
As Bob Costas says at the end of the HBO broadcast, he says Lennox Lewis has had better success with a microphone than he did handling the fight. Now, if you think we're hating, by the way, then come on now. I think Bob was telling the truth there. But just to talk about Paul Wallace stuff, you know, I actually read some comments from him. I know he's mentioned about the surgery and that he had and stuff, but Wallace apparently says that the peak healing time was 100 days. But he would actually prefer to have seen Klitschko stay at the ring for 6 months just to let it get, you know, fully healed. When was he back in the ring again?
December.
Yeah, 6 months later.
6 months later. There we go. And he only lasted a few more years before he had to retire. Was it injury or something? And he came back and
he was due to fight Rackman, I think, was it 2005, and he pulled out a couple of times with what was it, a leg injury
Back-
or something?
yeah,
Was
back
it-
Yeah, I think leg first time. I think he brought out twice, didn't he? Leg and back. But I think that was a huge blow to the heavyweight division because
It
Lewis
stagnated
retired.
at that time with Lewis.
Yeah,
Aye.
but you've already got this guy, already here now in Vitali, who looks like he's going to be a tough man to beat for quite a few years. He has a couple of fights, beats Corey Sanders, beats Danny Williams, who really only got there because he knocked out Shot Tyson. And then all of a sudden he's retired as well. And then from in 2005, the heavyweight division is an absolute mess. You got 4 different guys holding a title. You got these guys from Russia now starting to come over and start to pick up belts. And I
Ragamov,
think it was a huge anticlimax because I think fans were hoping Vitali would be the man to carry the division. And he came back years later, but he wasn't the same guy because obviously injuries and layoff.
The Rackman WBC title reign was something to behold, wasn't it? When he beat Monty Barrett for the interim title, and then he fought a shot James Toney, and then he got himself knocked out by Oleg Maskev, and believe it or not, I think that was on pay-per-view in America. I mean, it was just a dreadful time for the heavyweight division.
Yeah, there was some fun fights, but you had the WBA, tag team, with
John
Valiev
Ruiz.
and John Ruiz, then Ruslan Shagan.
Quezo, Cali Meehan.
They were just passing around the WBA belt, going back and forth. Vander Holyfield was still getting in the act as well, who I love, but, he's well past his best. But horrible time, really. But like I said, at the end of the fight, you got the Klitschko brothers in one corner and you got Lennox Lewis in another. That picture there, the 3 dominant heavyweight champions of the past 15 years, I'd say, all together in the same ring.
Yeah, I think final closing comments from me. I think you put it quite well actually there, Kurt. I think this fight, unsatisfactory ending to a great fight. I think it was just the end of an era. We saw some great names. Joe Souza working Klitschko's corner, Al Gavin, the cutsman in Lewis's, Harold Shadow Knight. Like I say, it was just the end of an era. And a real feisty panel back in Sky Sports before they became a little bit watered down and soulless. We had Jim Watt, Colin Hart and Barry McGuigan all giving it what for, and just a great time for the heavyweight division in general. If anyone has any closing comments before we run out, guys, then jump in now.
Although in the Sky studio they had Derek Williams for that fight, so
on the night, yeah.
Yeah, just
when I just to add this before Andy gives his final summation. Derek Williams actually had spent some time in the Lewis camp prior to the Vitali Klitschko fight. I remember Paul Dempsey in the studio saying, "So Derek, have you got any inside anecdotes into the Lewis camp?" And he was like, "Well, Lewis isn't planning to lose; he's planning to win." So yeah, thanks for that, Derek.
George Foreman at the start of the HBO broadcast at 54 stated he was actually going to return to the ring. He even spoke about potentially fighting Lewis. Then after he saw what happened and stuff, he says, "I don't go bother. I think I'll just stay retired."
Final word to you, Kurt.
Yeah, just a great heavyweight fight between two, top fighters of the division at the time, I'd say, and two dominant heavyweight champions in the end. Hindsight's, I think things change so quickly in boxing. A win can look better years later, a loss can look better also. And I think in that fight, it's amazing how, at the time, Vitali was seen as just basically a big joke, really, and he, what he is now. Lewis, what anyone says about him, and I'm not a big fan, but he did get the win legitimately. There should have been a rematch. There's no excuse for the rematch taking place. Huge money for the rematch. HBO, the fans. I mean, there's not many heavyweight fights over the past 15 years that you'd say to any boxing fan, do you really want to see that fight? And they'd say yes. That was one. HBO offered apparently huge money for the fight as well, with Manny Stewart saying, if it all works out, they could make more money than they did for the Tyson fight. And we all know how big that one. So there's no excuse. I mean, in some ways, I don't blame Lennox because I just personally think at that stage of his career, Vitali had his number, and I think Vitali would have beat him. And knowing Lewis, I think the type of guy he was, he did not want to end his career on a loss. He'd already suffered a couple of bad losses, and he got the win, and that was enough for him. He eyed up, Roy Jones, Mike Tyson, fights that he would have seen as easy fights and to retire on. I don't blame him for not really fancying the Klitschko rematch. I just wish he hadn't dragged it out and, kept fans' hopes up with it. But yeah, two great fighters and a great heavyweight fight, and hopefully there'll be more to come.
Thanks to Kurt Ward there, closing us out. From me, Steve Wellings, and Andy Patterson and Dave Lee. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of Punches from the Past. And if you haven't seen the Vitali Klitschko fight against Lennox Lewis, or if you haven't watched it for many years, I would urge you, like all the fights we cover, to go out and look it up. They're all on YouTube, so you'll be able to really enjoy and reminisce a great fight from the past. We'll catch you again soon, guys. Thanks for listening. If you have any suggestions, we have a list a mile long, but send them in to any of us on Twitter, and we'll speak to you on the next episode. Thank you.
I defeat the great champion.